Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, written by Mildred D. Taylor, is a story about the Logans, an African American family living in rural Mississippi in 1933, who are working hard to keep the small pieces of farmland they own while experiencing racial injustices. The narration of this story is made by Casey Logan, the second oldest child of the family, and is very naive when it comes to racism. She's 10 years old. Clayton Chester Logan, also known as Little Man, the youngest of the family and a diligent first grader. He's 6 years old. Stacy Logan, he's 12 years old, the oldest child of the family, and he acts like an adult child. Christopher John is the second youngest of the family, and he's very shy. He's 7 years old. David Logan, also known as Papa, he's the father of the family. He's not with the family most of the time due for him working on the railroad, so his family does not lose ownership of their property. Mary Logan, also known as Mama, the mother of the family, and a school teacher. Uncle Hammer, Papa's brother, who lives in Chicago and is a very impatient person. Caroline Logan, also known as Big Mama, she's Papa's mother. She's in her 60s. TJ Avery, Stacy's friend. He's the troublemaker. His family, the Averys, are sharecroppers in Granger's land. Lillian Jean Sims, Jeremy's sister, is 7th grader and who's often rude to Casey. Melvin and R.W. Sims, the older Sims brothers. They pretend to befriend TJ but make fun of him behind his back. L.T. Morrison, a burly man with streaks of white hair who works at the Logan's farm. Other characters included are Jeremy Sims, Lillian Jen's brother. He's often beaten by others in school for associating with the Logan children. Mr. Hammondson, a white man lawyer. His forefathers sold some of their land to the Logan family. Mr. Hammondson is very caring of the black community. Harlan Granger, a rich 10 square mile plantation owner who is anxious to buy back the Logan's land. Then we have the Wallace family, Caleb, Thurston, and Dewberry. They are the three brothers who run a general store on Harlan Granger's land. They are violent, brutal people, and murderers.
The Civil War left a lot of farmers without any labor, and previously enslaved people were in need of jobs. This resulted in sharecropping. Sharecropping is when a landowner allows tenants to use the land and in return are given a portion of the crops that the tenants produce. Unlike other black people in their community, the Logan family owned their own land. Post-Civil War, the Granger's family had to sell their land to a Yankee who then sold it to Cassie's grandfather. They took a lot of pride in owning that land, and Mr. Logan even had to find another job to keep it. Other black families were stuck in sharecropping. Sharecropping was an injustice to the black community because it took advantage of vulnerable citizens who were desperate for jobs. Many times, local store owners allowed sharecroppers to take what they needed, and the store owners would keep a running tab on those types of customers. After the Wallaces burned John Henry Berry, Mama felt that the family should stop shopping at the Wallaces and instead drive all the way to Vixen, named Vicksburg, because no one convicted the Wallaces in the burning, even though everyone knew who had done it. Even though they were no longer enslaved, many of the sharecroppers were so dependent on their landowners that they chose to ignore the injustice. At first, not many Granger's black customers were willing to do their shopping at Vicksburg because it was too far, and they didn't have any credit to back their tabs. When Mr. and Mrs. Logan came up with a way that black families in the community could boycott the Granger store, their land was threatened.
The Bill of 1875 granted all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States to be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law, and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. However, there was some debate over the growing power of general government, limiting the power of the states. Just 8 years later, the Supreme Court declared the Bill of 1875 unconstitutional. They found that the 14th Amendment granted Congress the right to regulate the behavior of states, not individuals. the civil rights that blacks had been promised during the Reconstruction era crumbled under white rule in the South. The plight of Southern blacks was forgotten in the North as they were segregated and condemned to live in poverty with little hope. Later, in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, the court's decision that separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional made segregation even more ingrained through a battery of Southern laws and social customs known as Jim Crow. Schools, theaters, restaurants, and transportation cars were segregated, separate but equal, and Jim Crow remained unchallenged until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the novel, Mary Logan was a 7th grade teacher at a black school called Great Faith. Most teachers there saw her as a disrupting maverick. To them, her ideas were always a bit too radical and her statements a bit too pointed. Page 31. At some point, Mary Logan was confronted by Daisy Crocker, a 1st and 4th grade teacher at Great Faith. She discussed an incident that happened with Mary's children during class. Clayton Logan, little man, had purposely damaged a book Miss Crocker had given him, and Cassie Logan, his older sister, had defended his actions and refused to accept her own book. Both Little Man and Cassie had refused to study out of a book that was in poor condition and labeled to be suited for Negroes. Miss Crocker thought it was an overreaction on their behalf and believed they should learn that that was just the way of things. However, Mary Logan did not believe that this racial segregation should be something acceptable. Mary Logan was well aware of where she stood as a colored woman and felt her students should know the entire truth about their history. However, on a day when the Board of Education, which composed of 4 white men, came to observe her teachings, one of the board members, Harlan Granger, picked up a student's book, turned the pages, stopped and said, "I don't see all them things you're teaching here." Page 183 to 184. Miss Logan said, "That's because they're not in there. All that's in the book isn't true." Mr. Granger said, "You must be some kind of smart, Mary. You know more than the fellow who wrote that book. Smarter than the school board too, I reckon. In fact, you so smart, I expect you'd best just forget about teaching altogether. Then that away, you have plenty of time to write your book." Page 184. This rash decision to terminate Miss Logan out of her teaching position was one of the many injustices the Logan family suffered throughout the novel.
The subject of injustice resounds in every word throughout the story. One of the major incidents was the fire at the end of the novel. After many trials that the Logans had to endure, not once did they dismay or stop fighting for their land and what was right for their community. Even when TJ decides to turn away from their friendship and cause the burning of the Logans' cotton field, the Logan family still stood up and found a way by any means necessary to spare his life. Although the end was inevitable, the lesson the children learned was priceless. They became aware of the injustice practiced in this world and initiated in them the will to change the outcome of their future. Although these characters are fictitious, the stories were a reality of the time and the injustice African Americans endured throughout the birth of America. The physical and emotional pain, humiliation that this group of people lived through was seen as an act of duty that the Anglo-Saxons believed to follow in order to keep the purity or holiness in the community. In other words, Christianity was the excuse used to justify lynching and burning of African Americans as the will of God against racial transgressions. It was also the excuse to form hate groups like the KKK to serve God's will for this country. Christianity played a huge role in the lives of Anglo-Saxons, but it was also heavily practiced by African Americans. In their eyes, they were the true redeemers of God by living this martyr life. This goes to show that Christianity is not intrinsic with lynching and burning. It was all an act of power and how to sustain it that justified these actions. Although we eventually signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 13, 14, 15 amendments, the will to hold power above a group of people has lived on with the growth of this nation. In recent times, we have seen the rise of many acts of violence by law enforcement against African Americans. These acts are all justified and never rightfully convicted in our justice system. That is why the rise of Black Lives Matter rose to bring awareness to these hateful acts. We also see the prejudice acts against many other minority groups. We can see the hindrance we cause by generalizing a group of people and justifying our actions under distorted truths. Obama once spoke about this in regards to terrorists in the Middle East and how they excuse their behavior, believing they're following the will of God, but points out that extremists can be found anywhere, not just solely in one group of people. He says, "Unless we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. So this is not unique to one group of one religion. There is a tendency in us, a sinful tendency, that can pervert and distort our faith. The beliefs of this country are stated in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must remind ourselves that hatred, injustice, and distortion of faith can be done by any human being, that this form of hatred and despise is based on having power and oppressing those that may be a threat in the eyes of the oppressor. Those that are oppressed must remember the foundations of this country and use them to defend basic human rights, to educate with humility, peace, and love, and move the process of equality, to really practice the beliefs of this country. Let us remember the words of the slogan as she comforts Cassie, and let us find hope in them to motivate us in these sour times. Baby, we have no choice of what color we're born, or who our parents are, or whether we're rich or poor. What we do have is some choice over what we make of our lives once we're here.